some of them could be updated. Yeah. So,
Oh, yeah.
Yes. Yes. Then, yeah, I think from my part it should be okay. Yeah, I can start by introducing Christian. Yeah, to the audience.
Yes. We are live now.
Okay. Yeah. Then maybe I can start.
Yes.
Okay. So hello everyone. Welcome to this IEEE expert program, and also it's the IEEE the DEM YP the expert speaker program. So today we are very happy to have Christian Janssen here to give us a talk, right? So let me briefly introduce Christian, right? So he's now the head of the cybersecurity section, right? The Department of Applied Mathematics and Computer Science at the Technical University of Denmark, DTU. And he's internationally recognized for his contributions to the field of computational trust and trust management. So he received the William Wilsonborough Memorial Award in 2014. And of course, he is a member for the National Council for Cybersecurity, which advises the Danish government, right, on cybersecurity issues and some of the challenges there. And he's also the chairman of the board of the Danish Hub for Cybersecurity, right? And which supports and coordinates the collaboration between knowledge institutions as well as industry. And he also serving as the vice chair of the International Federation for Information Processing Working Group 11.11 on trust management. And right now he has published more than 80 papers, right, on security and privacy, and of course trust here. And he also served as program chair, general chair, right, and also the program committee members, right, for many international conferences. So okay, so let's welcome Christian the talk. Okay, thank you.
So thank you, Veti. And I will share my screen here.
Okay.
There you go. So as Veti said, my name is Christian Damsgaard Jensen, and I'm the head of the cybersecurity section here at the Department of Applied Mathematics and Computer Science. In short, we call it DTU Compute at the Technical University of Denmark. And thank you very much for the kind words and the walk down memory lane with the things that I've been responsible for in my past, in my recent past. So today I'm not going to talk so much about trust, although there is, of course, a little element of trust in what I'm going to be talking about. But I'm going to be talking more about security, and in particular context-aware security, and how we can build security mechanisms that are context-aware. So context is important. Many of you may have had a similar experience walking down a seemingly infinite parking lot of cars that all look the same. And if you just remember that you parked your gray car next to a silver car, then you're out of luck in this parking lot. But if you remember that it wasn't that far from a yellow car, then suddenly that bit of context helps you decide where to look and where to be more kind of like just scroll along more quickly. So that gives you an indication of why why context is quite important in many different aspects of life. Another aspect here is an accident site where normally ambulance crew would not be given access to your medical data, but in its life-threatening situation, then perhaps they will be granted this access to your information, because they need to know whether they can use certain medicines on you, or if you have any pre-existing conditions that means that they should treat you in a particular way. So there again, context is quite important. Moreover, if you're looking at this accident site, you can see that there are first responders, but there are also journalists present and some other people who look like they're just bystanders. And of course, not all of these other people, like the press or the other passengers in other cars, should be given access to medical data. So there is a question. First of all, in this particular context, more people should have access, but not everybody should have access in this context. So there is quite an important question to answer when you try to find out who should be given access in particular situations. So when we talk about security in practice, we typically talk about or we distinguish between two types of security enforcement: the logical and the physical security enforcement. And the logical security is everything that we can enforce by the computer system itself. So typically we would log in to authenticate ourselves to the system, and then there would be some kind of an access control mechanism that decides what are the resources that we can access inside this system. But we also have physical security mechanisms. And these security mechanisms are enforced by something outside of the computer system. So something that the computer system itself doesn't really control. So typically we have server rooms that are locked so that the servers are protected from tampering by people just walking by. Or we can have buildings where we have guards or alarm systems to prevent people from just wandering in off the street and do some weird stuff to our IT systems, stealing it or similar. So when we look at these security mechanisms, the logical and the security, physical security mechanisms, we typically say that we cannot build logical security without having an underlying layer of physical security. So when we talk about our computer servers, they are locked in server rooms to prevent people from walking in, taking out a disk and mounting it on another system, and that way perhaps bypass some of the security mechanisms that we built into the system. We assume that the people who are logged into the terminal is actually the person sitting at the terminal. And of course, we have these auto logout functionalities, or we require a password after the screensaver has been activated to make sure that people who, if you walk away from your terminal for or your computer for a period of time, then when you, nobody can just, when you come back, that's actually, you have to authenticate again. So if your terminal has been inactive for a short period of time, then it cannot be accessed by somebody else. And then finally, we want to make sure that the objects that we produce in the system can only be accessed by the people who request that particular operation. And this is kind of like one of the problems if you're in an academic department and you are heading into exams in the exam period. If you want to print your exam script just to make sure that it actually prints nicely and looks correct, then typically you have a departmental printer that is not very well hidden and not very well protected physically, which means that as soon as you press the print button on your computer, then you have to run out of your office and sprint down the hallway and walk to wherever the printers are located to make sure that you are there before any students may get access to that printer. At least that's in several of the academic institutions I've been working at is the general setup. So if you're a student and you want to cheat with your exams, the period leading into the time where exam scripts should be handed in, you might start lurking around the departmental printers to make sure, or to see if you get an opportunity to get kind of like exam questions fresh off the press before the teachers actually have a chance to run and recover those prints that they've sent away. So again, it's a demonstration where the physical security is a requirement for the logical mechanisms that we build into our security systems actually work. So typically when we talk about computer security, we talk about the AAA, the authentication, the access control, and the accountability of the system. And normally there is an preceding step of identification where the user identifies to the system. So these are very standard ways of talking about security, authentication, authorization and accountability, or authentication and access control and accountability, as I have it here, because that's my preferred way of looking at it. There is a small, in my book at least, a small difference between access control and authorization, but I know that many places in the literature, these two words are used interchangeably, and I'm probably not come into that further in this talk. So when we look at the first steps there, identification and authentication, then basically the user identity that we use there serves three purposes inside the system. First of all, it allows us to represent different users as different identities inside the systems. So that we can get something from outside the computer system mapped into the computer system. So we map from the physical world into the logical world, and that username or whatever it is, the system identity, it's very often referred to as the subject identifier. Then when we have this kind of a mechanism, we have a user who is authenticated to the system or is mapped onto the system. We need to make sure that it is really who they are. So we have some kind of an authentication mechanism. There it could be either a simple login password. We could have a multi-factor authentication with a two-factor like you have on Google, where you get some kind of a message on your mobile phone or your smartphone. Or you can have some form of biometrics that you use there. So there are many different ways of authenticating to the system. But one of the reasons why we want to use this human identity from outside the system and map that into the system space is that creating identifiers inside the system space is easy. So I can create 1,000 users on a system if I'm allowed to. But I only get to have one physical identity that my government will authenticate for me. So that's why we very often want to link our system identities to outside identities, because it limits the amount of identities that any given user can create in the system. So we have this first step of mapping the user to a system identity. Then having these distinct identities inside the system for different users, we can now start defining access control policies. We can now distinguish between different human users and say, well, I will be allowed, so Christian will be allowed to access these files, but Robert will only be allowed to access these other files. So we can distinguish and we can define access control policies that distinguish between these two users or sets of users inside the system. But all of these, because we have this limitation of the mapping as one of our goals, so all of these internal policies are ultimately linked back to some outside identity, at least in most cases. And then it allows accountability, because if we record what human user is responsible for all the processes inside the systems and all the actions taken by these processes, then if something goes wrong, we can go out and say, well, it was actually Christian. He started the process that did these modifications to the system, and these modifications were bad. So therefore, Christian is responsible for whatever bad happened to the system. And so in order to have these this goal of accountability, we typically log at least some of the actions that go on inside the system, so that we can use that as evidence in case something goes wrong. We can go back to the user and say, well, Christian, you really shouldn't have done that, because that really had some very bad effects inside the system. And of course, that can go, if you cannot link that to a human user, outside the system, there will be poor accountability inside the system. So this step of authentication really, identification and authentication really takes care of 3 of the 4 fields that I showed you before in the AAA model, the authentication, authorization, and accountability. And then finally, we talk about access control, and that's going to be the main focus of the talk here today, is to look at how we can build an access control mechanism that can take context into account. And inside this access control model, or the overall way of building access control into computer systems, we have on the left side of the figure here, we have the subjects, the active entities inside the system. So those would be the processes that are started by users. And then there are, on the right side of the figure, we have the objects. So these are the passive entities, the resources inside the systems. Could be the files or database records, or it could be physical devices that we control from inside the computer system. So now the Mars Perseverance rover would be, or the Chinese rover, which name I cannot pronounce, but Weisi could possibly help me here, that are now roaming around Mars at the moment. They are remotely controlled by computers from Earth, and there again, we don't want everybody to go in and control these rovers. We just have particular users who are allowed to do so. So we have these subjects, the active entities, we have the objects, the passive entities, and then in between, for whenever some subject requests to perform a certain operation on an object, we have the reference monitor that intercepts all these requests and then looks at the local access control policies, evaluates that policies, and says, according to the policy, should this access be granted or denied? And that's basically the reference monitor should intercept all access requests and should verify that access is only granted if the policy says that it should be granted. I've hinted at this before. For this model to work, we need to have the authentication. We need to have some kind of a mapping of either users or roles or attributes onto that subject. So outside concepts or richer concepts that we want to work with, not just process identifiers, but something richer than that. And so there is an element of mapping going on here. And also the policies, they do not just emerge all by themselves. Typically, there is a system administrator who defines these policies, and that's actually the step that I would call authorization. And then the monitoring and the decision that goes on inside the system performed by the reference monitor, that's the access control step. The administrator defines typically the access control policy in some high-level language, using some of the concepts in the cloud on the left, so user identifiers or roles or some kind of an attribute. And then often there will be some extra mapping of the policy into a machine readable format that the reference monitor can then process so that it can look at the subject process identifiers or data structures associated with those processes and then decide, yes, I can grant this access or not. So as I indicated on the in the previous discussion there, we have a person sitting in front of the terminal or in front of the computer working on it. And we have the computer in the big black box in the middle. And then we have the resources, in this case, a disk array where the files that this user is trying to access sits there. The policies that we define are often defined in terms of this user sitting in front of the monitor and the actual files on disk. But the access control decision is made inside the black box, and there the computer cannot verify who that user is except by the authentication mechanism. So there is some kind of an authentication mechanism that maps the outside world to the inside world, and then that mapping is recorded for all the processes that this user starts. There is an identifier, typically a UID, recorded in this process in some of the data structures of this process. And then the reference monitor will look that up and decide this process who is trying to read this file, should it be granted access, yes or no? So these are the reference monitors works entirely inside the computer system and cannot know very much about what goes on the outside. And this may sound very trivial, but it has profound impacts on what kind of security mechanisms that we can build in our systems. One of the impacts you see here, how do you keep a secret in this room? Remember that I have my access control policy is defined in terms of which processes can access which files, okay? So from the computer point of view, I can allow read access to data, for instance, for the guy in the red shirt that you see in the foreground, and he will be granted the access to read that data, which means that he can now show it on his monitor. But there's not much to prevent any of the guys in black sitting facing us just behind him from turning around and looking at his monitor and seeing what is it, this very secret information that he has been authorized to see, but that these guys in black are not authorized to see. So there is information that we lose inside the computer, which is pertinent to the whole security of the system. Maybe not so much the formal enforcement of the access control policies, because they will still be upheld. They will still be true and valid, but it's just the purpose for which we define them will not be met in this kind of physical environment. So when we look at security policies in general and access control policies in particular, then we have this interplay, or that the logical and the physical security mechanisms have to work together. Okay, and when we start looking at this, how does that then really work? Because the physical security environment and the logical or the computer security environment, those are two completely separate worlds. Okay, so to paraphrase or to stereotype, the computer security mechanism is basically the domain of nerds. So this would be bespectacled people sitting in front of computers all day long, defining security things. And the physical security is the physical guards, the big guys in black flak jackets with the word security printed on the front of them, who decide what is secure and what is not secure. So there are two quite separate worlds that haven't really come together to build proper security that takes these two things into account. And when we look at it, then the logical security is a very fine-grained notion. So we can, in databases, we can define access rights down on record level. We can have very fine-grained file access decisions. We can include a lot of extra information into and a lot of context into the access control decision based on time of day, or perhaps the computer on which the IP address of the computer which requests the access. But all that fine-grainedness is for the logical security mechanism. Then we have the physical security mechanism, which is typically quite coarse-grained. I will be allowed into a building, or I will be allowed into a particular room in that building, but that's more or less the level of physical security that you get. Sometimes it can be that I have to be accompanied by somebody working for the organization, but still that just is to prevent me from wandering off too far from what I'm expected to see, not to keep me on a very, very narrow path. And that's one of the core problems that I'm addressing here today, that the computer security mechanisms that we look at are restricted to consider just the state of the computer systems. And we as humans are not part of that system. And also, everything that we use, I mean, we build computer systems because we need them to do something for us. So we need to be able to see something on a monitor, or so that the data has to be rendered on a monitor or printed on paper for us to be able to use it. And as soon as it's rendered on the monitor, as soon as it gets physical form, either on the monitor or on the paper, then it's outside of the logical domain. Now it's in the physical domain, and it's no longer the very fine-grained, very fine-tuned logical security mechanisms that decide the security of this data. Now it's the more coarse-grained physical security mechanisms. So when we want to constrain this access to data by physical security mechanisms, we can say, well, I can enforce confidentiality of my data by restricting access to all the output devices, so monitors and printers, and then I can ensure or enforce the integrity of my data by restricting access to input devices such as keyboards, keypads, or whatever other inputs that we have, input devices that we have for our computer system. So the granularity, we've defined this schism or this problem as the granularity gap in access control. Typically the granularity, as I hinted at before, the granularity of the physical access control really defines the context for the logical access control. Without knowing what, where the data is going to be displayed, we can't really make fully secure logical access control decisions. When we look at the domains, then the physical domain dominates the access control decision. So when I look at the minimum of the, and not in terms of granularity, but in terms of specificity of the access control decision, if I look at what is the least constraining part of the physical and the logical domain, then typically it will be the physical domain. And basically, and we get back to trust, trust is what fills this granularity gap that we have identified. So if we go back to the figure that I had before, then the logical security mechanisms can enforce security on the disk inside the computer system, getting up to the monitors and some of the input from the keyboard. But for everything else, we need trust. We need trust in the person that he's actually sitting in front of the computer, staying there, that he's making sure that nobody's shoulder surfing, that he's only looking at data in environments where people cannot easily see what it is that he's looking at, that he's not printing data onto insecure printers, and so on and so forth. So there is a large element of trust that we actually implicitly have in our computer security mechanisms. And that's, of course, why I've been so interested in trust management, is to try and make some of these trust assumptions more explicit in the enforcement of the security policies inside the system. But the context of the work that I'm going to be talking about today is more in the other direction, which is an old saying that is attributed to different, typically communist leaders. Lenin is one, Stalin is another. Trust but verify. It's also been attributed to Ronald Reagan, by the way, that that we have the full spectrum there. But we trust people, or we need to trust people. We trust people here because we need to trust them. But can we actually extend the scope of our logical security mechanism so that we get further into the physical world? Hence the title of my talk, bringing security into the physical world. So that's basically what we want to do. The way we do this is by defining now two separate security models. The logical access control model, which is just basically any standard access control model that you want to use. So we just say there should be a place for a logical access control model. And then we introduce really the new thing here is the environmental access control model. And so the logical, as I said, could be anything that you normally use: role-based access control, user identity-based access control, attribute-based access control, or whatever it is that you need to or want to build into the system. But of course, the access control models where you leave little discretion to the user are the more important ones, because those are the ones where you try to get beyond trust. You try to limit your reliance on trust by having these mandatory access control mechanisms. So these mechanisms are the more relevant for this type of work. So basically what the environmental access control model should do is that it should try to establish the context of the subjects and the objects that we are now talking about, that we are trying to make an access control decision about. And so what we do is that we define what we call authorization zones. So zones where access to data can be authorized. And this is, for instance, something that, it's based on the location or other properties that are relevant to the particular, basically the particular manifestation, the physical manifestation that our data takes. So for instance, if we talk about output devices, we have visibility zones. So that would be the area from which a monitor is accessible or can be viewed, even with a high resolution camera with a long lens on it. The printers would typically be the printer room if there is a lock on that printer room door, the floor if the printer is located in a printer room in a locked floor or wing in a building, or a whole building if there is a locked door on the front door. Now there is something on the chat. Wait, see, could you read that to me?
And actually, that's my question, but you can answer maybe after the talk.
Okay,
That's
I'll take questions after the talk. Fine.
Sure.
And then we enforce the logical access control policy inside these authorization zones. So that's where we take context into our decision. And then that requires us to have a continuous enforcement based on this context, because context can change. So we need to be able to change our enforcement in some way, or we need to change our visibility of the data that we have provided to people based on changes in the context. And I'll give you a motivational example here, which hopefully explains in a more easy way what I was trying to say before. So this is a standard open plan office with a number of cubicles. We have people working in these cubicles. One of them is watching some data that is restricted. That's shown with the yellow angle, and that kind of like the yellow field there is an attempt to illustrate from where the data on that monitor can be seen. The people sitting in the adjacent cubicles are all authorized, so that's why they're marked in green. But we also have a fifth person marked in red who is not allowed to see this data. So if one of the authorized people stands up and walks around, then that really shouldn't change anything, because he's allowed to see the data on the monitor. So the person sitting in front of the monitor working with this data should should still be allowed. That's not a problem. But then if this guy here, the unauthorized guy, sees it, then as soon as he enters into the visibility zone for that data, then something should happen to that data. We've built a few different prototypes. The ones that we reported in a conference some years ago was actually a quite crude mechanism where the window was simply iconified. So it was taken away from the monitor, and then you couldn't see it, but you couldn't work in it either, which could be slightly annoying if this red person was just walking through the zone to get out at the other end of the cubicle lane there. But that's one step that we could take in order to try and prevent people from seeing, and hopefully that gives you an idea of the more kind of abstract discussion I've given so far. There is actually some very concrete actions that you can do in order to try and enforce this mechanism beyond the logical domain. Of course, this requires you then to understand the context of the system. So we built a system where we have basically we're using the underlying logical access control mechanism of the operating system. But when a process accesses a file, it also alerts a visibility manager on the that runs on the computer, and then it also, when it creates windows on the screen, then and enters data into that window, then the visibility manager will be told what file data is actually visible in the different windows on the screen. Then we have a context manager, something that sits and monitors the environment. We have a number of sensors out there. We've been working with quite a range of different sensors, and of course we fell in love with surveillance cameras because they are, I mean, fantastic sensors for a whole lot of information. Of course, they're also from a privacy point of view quite problematic. So we also looked at using passive infrared sensors, or just simple sensors like these light breaking sensors that you sometimes have in some locations as well, to detect that somebody's moving in a particular direction. So we have a whole lot of different sensors. The environmental access control model is really not prescriptive in what should be the basis for the context, but we need to have information about the context. And then if a person enters the visibility zone for data, and that person is not authorized to see some of that data, then of course that window should be dealt with in some way. It should be made unreadable to that particular user. And as I said, we had a number of different experiments, and it's kind of like, it's still an ongoing effort here at the department to look at some of these things. But the most crude version is simply just to remove the window from the monitor. So how do we capture the context in general? We want to be sure about who's there, and also we would like to know if they're actually looking towards the screen, or they're looking away from the screen, because it's not a problem if they're looking away from the screen. And if you're taking, so I've talked a lot about monitors, I've talked a lot about computer systems, and stationary computer systems has been kind of like the context of what I've been talking about. But of course, we are increasingly getting onto laptop-based systems. And in those cases, there is the small camera on top of the laptop that can actually see who's standing behind us. And there are libraries out there that will help you do face recognition, in the sense not so much recognizing as also to recognize particular faces, but just to see that there is a face in view, so that you actually know there is somebody facing in your monitor, which you can then use to say, okay, I need to know who that person is, because I need to be able to decide whether he should be allowed to watch what's on the monitor here and now. If we go back to more kind of like an old school system, if we just say, well, whatever is shown in a room, everybody in that room should be authorized to see that data. Doesn't work well for open plan offices, works quite well for personal offices. Then we could have smart card readers installed near every door to these restricted areas. And then whoever enters the room should present their smart card to the smart card reader. And then we have a complete knowledge about everybody in the room. Of course, we may need to have some kind of a turnstile system, so that you can't tailgate people getting into the room. And that kind of gets to the crux of the big problem with this kind of a system, because we then need to inconvenience the users by having them stop and produce their smart card, but also it's quite expensive to install these turnstile systems and smart card readers everywhere. So with the increasing amount of CCTV surveillance that is being put into buildings around the world, and many office buildings has it have them, then wouldn't it be smart if we could just authenticate when we show up in the morning? So when we turn up to work in the morning, we authenticate once, and then the building basically tracks us throughout the day and keeps a record of where we are and whether we should be allowed, or if we are in a room, what data in that room is authorized for us to see. And I mispronounced something or missaid something here. The system actually doesn't need to know where you are. What it needs to know is who is present in the different visibility zones. So we don't need to be able to track people over the day. We just need to know that if a person is there, then who is it? And that's quite different from a privacy point of view. Of course, it requires that we trust that whoever installed the system has just siphoning data off on their own. But if they are good people, if we control the system well enough, then hopefully we can make sure that we actually don't have complete records of where everybody was at all times. So I actually think I have time for this, which is good. So the system that we so the sensor enhanced access control was the paper that I talked about, and that links into some other work that we did on persistent authentication, where we actually looked at this tracking capability. And essentially, when you initially authenticate to the system, then the smart building environment gets a notion of who you are. We talk about a blob. So that's a computer vision lingo for something that moves around in the foreground of the image. So that's one of the things that we need to track in the system. And so we have a continuous stream of video data. We when we initially authenticate the person, whatever blob was present at the place where that authentication took place, that blob will then get the ID of that person. Okay. And then when it moves around in the building, we can just we can observe this blob moving around in the building, and we can make sure that we keep that ID associated with that blob at all time. Of course, there is that blob may meet another blob in the hallway, and they may stand there for a while discussing. And cameras are not perfect, so sometimes there is some uncertainty afterwards whether these blobs got blended or mixed or whatever. So there could be a discussion or an uncertainty about whether the blobs separated, when they separated, who's who. Okay, so we have a confidence value that we need to associate as well with that blob, but that's all that we need from our persistent authentication. And of course, we can have other. So the camera that I showed you on the previous slide was just a dome-mounted camera, which is not very good at recognizing faces. We could have some cameras that are better at that in certain strategic locations. So as we move around the building, we could get maybe capture some biometrics and just say, yeah, we have that blob. We have this biometric data that fits with the authentication of that blob. So we get more knowledge about, or we get greater confidence in that blob being the person that it claims to be. So overall, during the day, we may lose a little bit of confidence in our authentication as time goes by. So that's kind of like a natural effect of these systems, and that's one of the reasons why we installed these extra or we promote to install these extra biometric sensors in the environment. And then we looked at how we can get this reconfirmation. So if we have the user A and then a user that's not user A, so A hat, we have user A at time 0, they are clearly separated. Then at time 1, they meet. And at time, then we still observe user 2 or user A, but we can see that when they meet there, we lose confidence. in this case, we basically don't know. We have two blobs. We don't know who's who. So basically, we think it's user A, but it could just as well be the other one. So our confidence is reduced to half. But then at time T2, we have a biometric camera that records biometric features that corresponds to user A. So our confidence in that the blob there associated with user A is actually user A increases. And we could have several of these events going on. And then there is another meeting with a dash there, and that reduces again, but then we can build up our confidence again slowly with these environments in there. So that's the mechanism that we've developed in context of the persistent authentication system. So security really depends on the context in which the decisions are made, and the context is defined by these different context attributes like the authorization zones or the visibility zones that we talked about. The access control policies should really take that contextual information into account. So things like user attributes would be security clearance, or whether they are a treating physician, are they a assigned caseworker in this particular case. And then object attributes would be things like security classifications, whether the patient has certain properties, like it's a geriatric patient. And then for caseworkers could be whether it's an unemployed person. And then there's some overall environmental attributes that you could have that, well, actually we are in a high alert state or we are in a very low alert state. So different contexts and different behaviors should be present and should be displayed at these different times. Or are we in a hospital ward, or are we home visiting a patient? That again would give some information on what kind of information could be made available, because the security of home networks may not be as strong as the security of hospital networks. So maybe we want to show a little less information at home. Also there, we cannot in the same way guarantee our context-aware sensor-enhanced access control may not be able to see who is shoulder surfing. So the doctor there will maybe be shown a little less information on his monitor than he would otherwise, or on his laptop than he would otherwise be shown. And we think it's quite important that these access control mechanisms are there to help enforce these policies. And that was basically my summary. There's just less than 15 minutes left for questions.
Yes, thanks, Christian. So yeah, when you check the Q&A here, and there are two questions raised by Mohammed. So the first question is that on slide 15. So the question is, which are the trust assumptions here? Which of the shown entities are trusted and which are untrusted?
Go back to sharing here, slide 15.
Yeah.
It worked different than from what I thought. Okay, so typically, I mean, these are all part of the security mechanism. So therefore, they're part of enforcing the security policies. So therefore, we trust the mechanism. So the reference monitor is part of the operating system. The visibility manager is what we provide. Of course, we tend to believe that. The context manager is also something that we provide. So again, that's something that we trust. We could discuss, we need to have some kind of authentication of the sensors. So we make sure that it's our own sensors. So there is some element of trust there. But if we enroll the sensors, then we know which sensors we can trust. So the only thing shown here on the figure that we don't really trust is the people outside. So we need to trust that the sensors together provide a sufficient good picture of who that person is in order to enforce our policies. And of course, if there's a large crowd there, maybe somebody can hide in the crowd. And in that case, the context should either, the context manager, depending on the data that you want to display, should either say, well, we can, the confidentiality requirement for this data is so high that we cannot show them now because we are not sure that everybody in this crowd is allowed to see the data. And either you need then to bring everybody out and then bring them in one by one so that you have a better information about who they are and are more confident that everybody has been observed and has been monitored. And you can even require them to go somewhere and authenticate at this initial authentication spot so that you know who they are with a greater confidence. But if your confidence is high enough and you're for you to know that, for you to believe that, yes, this is in fact the person in front of me, then you can show the data. Did that answer the question?
I think so. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
And then, as I said, with to the second question, I think I touched upon it in the talk, that if you track people around all the time, then yes, that is a very worrying thing for an employee to have in their workplace. But when you think about what you need for an access control decision, I don't need the history. I just need to have enough history for me to be confident that the blob that I have, who that is. I just need to be confident in my identity for that blob, which means that as I move around, wherever I am known to be there. But where I was 5 minutes ago is not known to the system. And that's how the system should be configured. And that way, the system is not different from a system where I'm required to enter my password every time I do something, or I'm required to use my my badge to get into a room every time I want to go into that room, because that still records and actually most of badge systems actually record that as part of the security log. So once we have enough confidence in the system working, then I would take all that log information away and make sure that it's never recorded, so that we don't know where people are at any given time. We know where they are at any given time, perhaps, but we don't know where they were 5 minutes ago. And even I think that a mechanism that says where everybody is, I mean, there are systems where that could be quite useful. But it's something that you only want to implement with all your employees' agreement, and you need to think very careful about it before you implement it in the system. I could imagine in a hospital, for instance, it could be quite useful to know where a particular specialist is, so that if you have an emergency relating to that, you know that you have to call him from there, instead of these general announcements on hospital PA systems, where they are looking for a doctor such and such to go to a particular operating theater. I hope this also answered your question. How can the administrator be sure that the access is good enough? I think that's an inherent problem in the access control model, isn't it? Do you capture everything? Maybe not. I mean, you need to make sure that when you place, you need to have defined your visibility zones. Right now, they are not. I mean, the monitor that I have in front of me here in my office is not equipped with a camera, so I have a separate camera on there. But with laptops, you have an idea of who's in the background, because you can see that on the camera. Of course, that means that you need to have the camera enabled all the time, and that's also a problem potentially in a system. But that's one way of knowing that you are in an environment, and what environment that you're in. But for more physical, statical systems, it's not that hard, I think, to know that the visibility zones, how they are. then you can start talking about reflections of light. And there is a lot of work regularly published by people from, especially some people from Israel, the Ben Gurion University of the Negev, who looks at a whole lot of kind of like the flickering of light from the monitor and Fennec freaking and these kind of things. That you can observe what is going on inside the room. The overall area of this is called tempest controls. And I think we're getting beyond commercial security systems if that's the kind of things that we are trying to prevent against. Maybe the big banks and the militaries are the ones that would be focusing on these kind of controls. Comprehensive. Survey like that to get a comprehensive view of the access control policies. I mean, typically the best way to do this would be to look at a recent PhD thesis on access control, or any of the textbooks. So one that I particularly, Matt Bishop has a nice textbook on computer security, which is quite comprehensive in the area of access control. It is a little old, and there has been a lot of development in the area of attribute-based access control lately. So it's probably not up to date there. That's probably the best answer I can give you here now. So it's actually it looks like I have to disable the background. Where's the none? So this is the book that I'm talking about. That's an older version. Most likely there's a newer version out there. So now you also got to see my office. Any questions on the weakest link in cybersecurity? Yes. My comment is that this is a spurious argument. If we build computer systems to be used by humans, and we do not take into account that humans are fallible, then it's the security mechanism that is not well designed. I think it's kind of like very cowardly to say the humans are the weakest link. I mean, it's for sure that it's the easiest way to attack at the moment, but it's I think it's because we haven't designed our system so that they take into account this aspect of human nature. And I don't think we should blame the users. So I have systems from my organization where I am basically required to click on links in emails that are sent to me, which makes it very difficult for me as a security professional to go out and tell everybody else, don't click on links in emails, because basically that's a behavior that is not only desired, but actually required for some of our internal systems. And if you can spoof mail addresses, then you can basically get things in under the radar. Of course, you then look at the links and do they look proper? But I think we've created a world where convenience has been master, and that works well with human users because we want convenience, but security has not really been considered when we do these things. And the fact that we're designing systems that should be used by users is all too rarely the case.
Thanks, Christian. Yeah. So Ali, do we have any other questions from Facebook or YouTube?
It seems there is no questions. So thanks for this nice presentation. Very fruitful.
You're welcome.
Okay.
And thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk to all of you.
Thanks, Christian, and the support to the IEEE Young Professional Affiliate Group in Denmark. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Okay, that's great. Then, yep. Have a good day.
Same to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.